Hi, I wanted to make this video to give you some feedback on the discussion that I just graded and also talk a little bit about the homeworks, okay? First of all, to get to the discussions, I'm not going to have a fixed rubric per se. The rubric that I used in this particular discussion, I looked at your organization and your effort. And for most people, I think they got full credit there. And then I looked at basically whether or not you answered the problem. So did you follow the directions and give a question that you wanted to answer? And then did you select 3 variables, okay? And then finally your response. And in the future, I will post a little rubric, but again, it's going to vary from problem to problem. And there were people who totally did not follow the rubric and I gave them full credit, and I'll discuss that. I don't like to make things kind of cookie cutter, okay? I'm looking for really your thinking, whether or not it's valid, and the quality of your thoughts. Those are the much more important aspects to this assignment. Okay, what I want to do now is I want to go through the good, the bad, and some of the takeaways from this George Floyd discussion. First of all, I want to really give you guys a lot of credit. Everyone was very civil, and that's super important. I sometimes semi-facetiously joke that statistics consists of the study of all those things your relatives fight at over the Thanksgiving Day table. And it's true, right? Race, income, religion, all of these things, gender, okay? They're all things that we deal with in statistics. And these are the things that as human beings we're actually interested in, okay? But everyone was really good. The only comment I would make is that for some people, you might want to think a little bit about your tone, okay? For example, instead of saying, dear so-and-so, in your response, you forgot this or you missed this, instead you could word it and say, dear so-and-so, did you consider this? See, totally different tone. And you may find out they actually did. You may learn something, okay? But again, this is something that you learn, and I'm not going to really ding people on that, okay? One of the other really good things, a lot of people put a lot of thought into this, okay? A lot of background information, your own experiences, the arguments that people made were clear, they were logical, they were well developed, and I was really impressed by that. Very good. The bad was not that bad, and I think there are things that you can kind of easily clear up. The one thing I noticed was piggybacking on the responses. Okay, so you can't say me too, or I agree, or great job, okay? You can say that, but then you still have to have a response where you're making a critical comment or asking a question about something. And the reason why we do this is part of the purpose of the discussion is for you to learn to think critically about things. You should never just hear a statistical study and accept it at face value. There should always be things that you ask questions about, and I want you to get into the habit of learning how to do that. I did not take off credit for piggybacking this time, but I will in the future. So everyone got full credit for the response if they did it, okay? The one thing that people got dinged on a little bit in some cases was really not defining their questions. So some people just wrote off issues, okay? I wanted you, and part of the purpose of this exercise was for you to take a really complex, controversial, emotional issue and boil it down to an actual problem we could study. And so some of you did that. Some people said, okay, let's look at a specific focused question like police training, okay? And it's generally better to look at a smaller, well-defined, focused question than try to address, this huge question of racism, okay? I generally did not take off points for that, but there were a few people who really were just purely dealing with issues and not questions, and I took off a little bit. I didn't take off for this, but there was some confusion about what a proxy and what a question is. Remember that a proxy is, in real life, if you look up the actual definition of the word proxy, it's something that stands in for something else. In this case, we want to study racism. We have some question about racism, but we cannot measure racism, right? I can't put a little meter to your head and say, oh, you're 15% racist, right? We don't have that technology. So what do? We measure other things that we think either indicate the presence of racism or reflect the measure of racism, okay? And that's what a proxy is. A proxy is a variable that stands in for another variable that we can't measure, all right? Again, I didn't take off points for it. One thing I did take off a little bit of points for a few people was this notion that we could create a question and study causality. We cannot study causality in this problem, okay? We're doing an observational study. And there are observational studies where you can establish causality, like smoking, for example, but you have to do a lot more work than what we're doing, okay? You can study whether or not there's a relationship between certain variables, but you can't study causality. And I'm going to talk later on when I discuss the takeaways, why that's so important, okay? The last thing I took off credit for a little bit on a few people was if you had a variable or variables that were not relevant to your question, right? That was the point. You were supposed to pose a question and then think of 3 variables that would help you answer that question. And a few people kind of had a disconnect there, so to speak. But again, the minor points were really small. For the future, don't piggyback, follow directions. If you have any questions, contact me. I'm more than happy to discuss this with you, okay? And this is going to lead into the last part. So there was one student that totally did not follow directions. And they wrote a thesis about why they could not answer the question. And they argued that our personal biases and our beliefs made it impossible for us to study this objectively. This is a really good point. This is not a trivial point, okay? I'm on discussion boards of professional statisticians, and I see this issue constantly. They didn't follow any of the instructions, but what did they do? They logically thought about it, they gave a valid argument, and it was a good one. And this is why I'm not going to have predefined rubrics per se. If you follow the instructions, okay, you will get full credit. But if you don't, and you have a perfectly reasonable argument, response, I will accept that. If you have questions, if you're not sure, feel free to contact me. I'm more than happy. I love discussing these, as you can tell. I'm more than happy to get into the weeds with you and explain, yes, this looks right, this looks wrong, give you some hints, right? Well, we really want in this problem to do this. We're not trying to do this. And that's perfectly fine, okay? So, this thing about the takeaways, okay, that I'm going to get into now. One of the things that I want you to take away from this class, not just this assignment, is that you should never read a statistical study and think you know the answer. There are so many unknown unknowns in statistics. Look at the placebo effect, if you don't believe me. And if you think there's a rational explanation for the placebo effect, go read more about it. It makes no sense. Okay, no rational person would think the placebo effect exists. And yet it does. It's something that we don't know about that affects our results. Same thing is true here. There are a lot of things that go into racial disparities. And so the other piece of advice I'd like to give you, besides just don't assume you know the answer, always keep an open mind, is to realize that when you're collecting data, you don't want to just collect data that necessarily supports what you think. Let's be honest. Everyone has their own opinions, okay? That's unavoidable. We can't change that. We're a product of our background and our environment, okay? We are what we are. But what we can do is we can try to safeguard and ensure that at least we try to be fair. So some people, and again, I didn't take off points, and this is, in some sense, a minor point, but in some sense, for the takeaway in this entire class, it's actually an important point. Some people posed a hypothesis. They said, I know what's going on, I think it's this, And then they actually cited 3 statistics. Not only did they get 3 statistics that supported their thesis, but the thing you have to understand is that there are a lot of factors that are responsible for racial disparity. Racism is one. Socioeconomic status is another. Education is a third. So when you hear these things in the news where people are talking about, oh, you know, this certain minority has this going on and this group has this, and the fact that they're different means there's racism, they might be right. But you also have to realize there might be other explanations. What is the answer? Nobody knows. And you could make the argument, and I don't want to be pessimistic here or be negative, but some people make the argument that actually you cannot address these questions with statistics because trying to deconvolute socioeconomic status, race, and education is almost impossible. Okay? Not to mention a host of other things, right? There's culture, there's all sorts of things, and some people brought these up. So I want you in the future, okay, to try to keep an open mind. Don't think you know the answer. You can have opinions, that's fine. But always be willing to accept information on the other side that will help you realize that it really is your opinion. It's not necessarily a fact, okay? And also, when you're looking at studies, think about other things that might account for it, not just things that confirm what you believe. And that's really important, okay? All right, so that's all I have to say for the discussions. Overall, really good, guys. My only piece of advice would be don't piggyback. If you have any questions, see me. Okay, I can answer questions. It's not out of bounds or outside the rules. Last thing I want to talk about is the homework. So you probably noticed that in Module 1, we used Pearson. And in Module 2 and 3, I wrote homework problems. I'm going to try to stick to Pearson as much as possible. Okay, I really do think it's important that you have continuity, all right? If you read my lecture notes, for a portion of you really won't have to read the text, but I like having the text there as a backup if you need it or you want more information, okay? And I think it's important that the homework problems are pulled from the book. The only reason why I deviated in those last 2 modules was because the book is just way too complicated, gives way too much information, and actually says things that are incorrect. And so I wanted to make it more focused for you guys and easier. But I am going to try to just use Pearson from now on. An important kind of corollary to that fact is that you really want to stick to the modules when you're doing the work. If you ever have any doubt where we are and you follow the modules, you'll always be on the right track and on the right train. So one student asked me, could you open up the discussion tab in the sidebar of Canvas, because I like clicking and going to that, and that's what I'm used to. And I said no. And the reason why is I don't want you clicking to extraneous stuff. I really want you following the modules just because, there are so many moving parts to this class. If you follow the modules in that sequence that they're listed, you will always be doing the right thing. In every module, everything closes on Sunday. The George Floyd was one exception, okay? But this is always how it's going to be. A module is going to cover 1 week, everything's due on Sunday, do it in that order, and you simply cannot go wrong. And I hope that helps a lot. I hope it's simplifying, even though it might be different from your other classes. I'm hoping that this rule is so simple and so straightforward that it's just straightforward and you're not going to have any difficulties with it, okay? All right, thanks for watching. Great job. Keep up the good work.